We've all done something. We all have that one thing that we promise ourselves we'll go to the grave with. No one will ever know. For many, it's embarrassment. They've stooped beneath their perceived levels of dignity and done something that they certainly know would have others view them in a different light. They wouldn't write them off. They wouldn't exile them in any sort of way, but they certainly wouldn't view them the same. For others, it's a little more serious than that, or a lot more. Some, if it were known what they had done, this single secret thing that will go to their grave with them, they would be disowned by family members. They would be excommunicated by friends and social circles. Many people would lose their jobs. For others, it gets even worse. Some would do jail time. Some would go to prison. And there are others who would face the executioner. We've all got that one thing. I have it. Where does mine fall in on this spectrum? What would be my penalty if this single, terrible, heinous act, this crime against humanity that I carried out, if it were known, how would I end up? Well, I actually Googled it to find out, and I found that I, in the least, would escape execution only because my home state outlawed the death penalty just last year. Otherwise, I would certainly have a much-deserved date with the chair of the needle. Tried to forget about it. Wasn't possible. Something like this cannot simply be forgotten, no matter how many years passed, and there has been many. Tried to stay busy with other things. Maybe if I kept my mind active, thinking about other issues. That didn't work either. I resorted to try to burying it with alcohol, with drugs. All that did was cause more problems. The biggest being that I found myself as a substance abuser not knowing how to stop. Well, that led to having to deal with that issue, which I did. I sought out a counselor. I've never been one to view doing so as a sign of weakness, asking for help, that is. I've always viewed asking for help as a sign of strength, a show of strength. So I sought out a counselor who specialized in substance abuse, and what I found was that I paid a pretty premium just to be given a prescription that required myself attending 12-step programs, meetings, if you will. The secret society of those who meet in church basements around our community is what I'll call it. I did that for a time, and it helped. What I found mostly was once you get through the first 10 days or 2 weeks and you get through the tremors and other detox issues that are quite physically painful, the rest, for me at least, was relatively easy. Because though I did abuse substances and became addicted to said substances, I found through my soul searching, if you will, through the help of medical professionals, psychological professionals, and people who have done this themselves, that I am not what you would call an alcoholic. I am not part of that small percentage that benefits from such a program that is required lifelong. I guess I was able to put the plug in the jug and keep it there, so to say. I did attend those meetings for a while, and I followed the suggestions of the people. I took their advice. I even got a sponsor and did their steps. It's kind of part of the story, because one of those steps involves making a searching, fearless moral inventory of yourself. This is where you take a look at all those terrible things from the past, which I never had a problem with, except for this one single dark secret that didn't just ruin lives, but cost lives. There are people who suffer as a direct result of my actions, who pray for death because only then will their suffering cease. And to this day, they have no clue I had any part in the atrocities that afflict them. But I wanted to give this program a chance. I wanted to give it a shot, not so much to get off of the sauce, so to say, because by this point I had, and I never had the cravings. But I wanted to have peace. I wanted this thing off my chest, but still I was filled with fear, because once I made this list, this searching, fearless moral inventory of myself, I had to admit to myself, which I've done, and to God, which I've done, and to another human being the exact natures of my wrongs, which I'd never done. Not because of pride, not because of ego, but out of the fear that if it were to become public knowledge of what I'd done, I would go to prison for life. But the time has come for me to confess. Otherwise, I was destined to, in time, just go back to repeat old habits that were bad habits that led to worse places, certainly nothing good. But I wanted a reprieve. I wanted rid of these sins I'd committed. I was told by my sponsor, we'll call him Jim for the sake of keeping it simple, though Jim is not his name, to write these things down. Write them down. He said, take it easy at first, you know, go with some of the softball, easy lob type stuff. Memories that aren't too painful, things you did that you know weren't right, but you know, didn't really hurt anybody long term in the end. He was making it easy for me. And I did that. And I went through the years and I went through the list. And when I came to the single most heinous act of treachery, again, this crime against the soul and the spirit of mankind, this thing that cost lives and continues to haunt the living who wished they had died. When it came to this, I dared not write this down, for that would leave a trail of evidence. Should anyone find those notes at any time in the future after I'd gone through this soul cleansing experience, so to say, it would not end well for me. So I didn't write it down, though I was fully prepared to discuss this issue, to speak of this thing, to even name some of those harmed, and to give details of how their lives were ruined, and how those who perished because of what I'd done were the ones who'd gotten off easy. It's how terrible this single act that I'd sworn until now to take to my grave was. So I went and I met with Jim. We'd gotten together. We had a few minutes of small talk. How are you? I'm great. How about yourself? Just dandy. He let me have it. Right off the bat, he said, look, he goes, I'm not going to waste my time or yours. I know there's that one thing that you've sworn to take to your grave that you'll never tell anybody about. I want to get to that first. What is it? I'd come prepared. I'd hashed out in my head exactly how I was going to say it. I was going to tell him with every explicit detail exactly what happened, what I did with my hands and with particular instruments of doom, some of which were power tools. I looked him square in the eyes and I lied my ass off. I never mentioned it. And as a result, I never unloaded this elephant-like weight from my soul. I continued to carry the burden. I talked about all the other stuff. I got rid of that. It was very freeing to an extent, but not entirely, because that for which I should be incarcerated for life in the least, and had I come and made this video and told this tale just a year and a half ago, certainly for which I would have been executed, still weighed heavily on my mind, my spirit, my soul. It affected me physically. I am a healthy man with an active lifestyle, and I eat a healthy diet. I don't smoke. I no longer drink or drug. But I would become ill at times simply because I had not released the toxins associated with carrying the weight of the memory of this atrocity. I continued to go to that program for a while, the secret society of those whose members meet in church basements around the community. But in time, I stopped. You see, I'm an empath, and I absorb other people's emotions. And I've got to be very careful with whom I will allow myself to associate. I've got friends that are upbeat and positive, and I can spend all the time in the world with those guys and girls, and I like to do it because every time we part ways, I feel better than I did before I got around them. But then there are those who are negative, pessimistic, downtrodden by nature in their outlook on life, even though they've got the world. They just can't see it. Now, I've got to stay away from those folks, or I'll end up feeling as bad as they do, and I don't like being miserable. And that's kind of what drove me away from that program. God bless those folks. Most of them, they're not drinking, but they just didn't want to take a look at the other issues that they were afflicted with outside of the addiction. I'll tell you, one woman in particular really drove me off. She clearly had borderline personality disorder, and she sought me out as an unworthy and undesirable, and it just brought back too many memories and too much pain from my past. And well, I had already divorced my family of origin because of similar reasons, similar undealt with mental illnesses, and I simply wasn't going to go back onto the same stage and fill those same roles with similar players. Though we did not share DNA material, they were the same actors on the same stage, and I knew how it would end up, the same Shakespearean tragedy. So I politely bowed out, stopped going to the secret society of the members who meet in church basements scattered throughout the community. But I never discussed this issue, and here recently, there's been a series of events happen in my personal life and in my community, tragic events, a toxic web of fate, if you will, that has brought my actions from all these years past, things I've done that have contributed. It's brought it back to the surface. I never lost contact with my old sponsor, who again we're calling Jim. I'd see him off and on. He'd actually text off and on. Sometimes I'd text him back. But recently I happened to be out and about there in town, and I ran into him in person. And he approached me, said, "Hey, how you doing?" I said, I'm well. He works at the university, so I can't say I'm good. He'll correct my grammar. So I let him know I'm well. "How about yourself?" He says, "I'm well." He asked me if I was sober, and I said, "I am today," and that's good enough, because it's all one day at a time. And I said, "I'm going to be honest with you, though. You know, when we got together and I made those admissions to you, I left something out." He said, "I know." I knew that he knew. I mean, he's been sober for almost 40 years without relapse. And I said, you know, here lately, there's been some things happen, and it's come back to the forefront of my mind. And I feel like I have to get it out, but I don't want to tell you. I don't want to tell you, and I don't want to tell anybody about what I did, this terrible thing. And he said, why? He goes, why do you want to continue to carry this burden, this weight on your soul? What is it? And I said, you know, it's not so much what I've done. It's just that I know if it becomes public knowledge, I'm going to prison for life. But I also know I can no longer bear this weight, and the time has come for me to confess. We stood in silence. He finally spoke and he said, look, I know someone you can tell. He says, you don't have to tell this person your name. You don't have to tell them where you live, where you're from, what you do. You don't have to tell them anything about yourself. But you can tell them about this single heinous act, as you call it, that costs lives, that continues to cause suffering among the living. You can tell him everything, you can get it all out, and you can be done with it. And you can get on with your life and live happy, joyous, and free. And he says, I can take you to see him now if you'd like. I had the time. All I have is time. And I said I'd appreciate that. So he said, get in the car. We're on the side of the curb there on the sidewalk, and we got in his car and we started driving. He said, no, he's on the other side of town, but I'll bring you back when we're finished. I said, that's fine. We're going down the road, a little bit of small talk, and he pulls into the drive-thru at McDonald's. He asked me if I wanted anything. I said, no, thanks. I don't eat fast food, and I wasn't hungry anyway. So he orders a value meal, a quarter pounder with cheese and fries and a Sprite. But when he got his food, he didn't dig in. He didn't start eating it. He rolled up the top of the bag, and he reached into the back seat of the car. And he put it in the back seat, and we got on the way. In time, we made it to the other side of town. He pulled into a parking lot, and he nodded towards the park on the other side. There's a park just off to the side of our town's library. There was a bench in the center, and there was this older black man sitting on the bench, and it was chilly, much like today. It was earlier in the week. This guy was sitting on the bench. He had on a toboggan and a coat, and he was just sitting there. Jim reaches into the back of the car, the back seat, and he pulls out the bag of McDonald's, and he hands it to me, and he goes, go over there and give him this and tell him it's for me. And he says, listen, here are my only conditions for this. You know, as your former sponsor, because you're no longer in the program, he goes, don't waste any more time with this. You've wasted enough of your own. You've wasted enough of mine. Don't waste his. You give him this bag. Tell him it's for me. Let it all out. Tell him what it is you've done, this thing you don't want to discuss with anybody. And make sure you're finished with your story by the time he's finished eating that meal. I said, okay. So I took the bag, walked across the street. I went over to the park bench, and I sat down beside this gentleman, and I handed him the bag, and I said, this is from Jim. And I head nodded over towards the car, and he looks over and sees the car, and him and Jim acknowledged each other with a head nod, and he looks at me and he says, well, tell Jim I said thanks. I said, I will. So he opens up the bag, he unrolls it, and he reaches down in there, and he pulls out a fry, and he's chewing on it. It's still warm. I can see a little bit of steam still coming up. And he reaches in, gets another fry, and gets ready to bite into it. And he looks at me and he says, well, I could see that Jim had been right. This guy did not want me wasting his time. So I didn't. I got on with it. That's what I took his well to mean. So get on with it, I did. And I didn't hold back a single detail. I let it all out. I even remember the date. It's one of those things that the date of which you'll never forget. Told him when it happened. And even though it was so long ago, it still feels like yesterday. That's how much of an impact this heinous act has had on my life, on my spirit, and on my soul. He reaches in, he grabs his quarter pounder with cheese. He's listening, he's talking, he's looking down. Just, you could tell this guy, it's almost as if he were a trained listener. I found myself wondering, what kind of a past does this guy have? I mean, is he a retired therapist? He was probably in his late 60s. Was he a Buddhist monk? He certainly came across as a very wise Swami. As he ate his food, he listened to me talk, and he finished his food just as I finished the story, and He's sipping on his Sprite, and it makes that really annoying sound it makes when the cup's empty. We all know that sound the world over. And he looks at me and he says, "And?" I said, "And that's it. That's all of it. That's every gory detail." He stares at me and just goes, gets up, wads up the wrappers, he puts them in the bag, and he walks over to a trash can, throws it in the trash can, and well, I was figuring he's going to come back and just tell me to go say 3 Hail Marys and 2 Our Fathers, something to that effect, but he doesn't. He just starts walking away. He crosses the street, doesn't even wave at Jim, just heads on down towards the bus stop. But that's when it occurred to me, wow, it really was that easy. It really was that simple. I will be 50 years old soon, and I've been carrying this thing around for more than half my lifetime. More than a quarter of a century, I've allowed this thing to keep me at times depressed, drunk, high, miserable, at times somebody that nobody wants to be around, even those that love me most. And all I had to do was tell somebody else about it. Like I did just a couple days ago on that park bench. And what I thought was so serious was so not serious. All this guy had to say about it was, like he was saying, "That's it? What's the big deal? Then what?" And he just walks off without saying a word. I sat there on that bench for a couple of minutes and just kind of allowed myself to enjoy the feeling of being free in such a way, to such a degree, I can't remember. I finally collected myself and walked back across the street, got back in the car. Jim didn't say a word to me. He just pulled out of that parking lot and takes off heading back to the part of town where he'd found me, where we'd met that day. But we didn't speak the whole way over. It's like we were just feeling the energy of pure freedom. So we get back to where we'd met, and Jim pulls over to the curb to let me out, and I open the door, and I say to Jim, I say, "Wow, I can't thank you enough. I've never felt this free." And he says, "You're welcome. Genuinely, I mean that. You are very welcome, and I'm proud of you for finally having done that." And I look at him, I say, "Man, your sponsor is an amazing guy." And he says, "Who?" I said, "Your sponsor." He goes, "What do you mean, my sponsor?" I said, "The guy back there you just took me to talk to." He says, "That guy's not my sponsor." I'm like, "Well, who is he?" He goes, "I don't know. I've never met that guy. I just knew you needed to get this off your chest, and I figured that guy could use a meal."